Very good morning, friends. I hope you're safe as well as healthy. Well, in the previous video, if you have seen, I had given an entire thought process in terms of how the opening balance sheet, what you call a third balance sheet on the date of transition, is to be prepared. So I give you that there is supposed to be a retrospective application of the Ind AS, even if you're a first-time adopter. So there is a general principle. And I said that general principle is got a total of 4 adjustments. But I also said that the companies being first-time adopters have been given certain exemptions as well as exceptions, or you can say indirectly relaxations, where the Ind AS 101 to the first-time adopters is prohibiting the retrospective applications, or in certain cases giving them an optional choice that they want to go for a retrospective application or they want to go in for a prospective accounting. Now today in this particular video, I am not going to talk of E&E, that is the exceptions and the exemptions. My focus is only going to be on the general principle. Now what is the general principle in terms of making the opening Ind AS balance sheet? That we want a retrospective accounting. Now, in order to ensure that retrospective accounting, as I said, the general principle laid down in Ind AS 101 is that we need to consider a total of 4 adjustments. Now, what are these 4 adjustments? Let's take little examples and a look on these 4 adjustments. But remember that these 4 adjustments has got exceptions as well as exemptions. But that would be in terms of the next video. So let's find out those 4 adjustments required as a part of the general principle to get a retrospective effect in terms of the third balance sheet.
अनअकैडमी पर मैं आपके साथ लेके आ रहा हूं सीए फाइनल के लिए एक इन डेप्थ इंड एस का बैच। सर ये इन डेप्थ इंड एस का बैच क्या है? भाई ये इन डेप्थ इंड एस का बैच है जहां पर आपके साथ हम वो टॉपिक्स कवर करेंगे जो एग्जाम के अंदर ऑलमोस्ट 65-70% वेटेज रखते हैं। सीएफएल में वैसे आप जानते हैं कि सारे के सारे आपके जितने भी कोर्स में हैं वो सब इंडेस ही हैं फाइनेंशियल रिपोर्टिंग के अंदर, लेकिन उनमें से कुछ इंडेस हैं जिनकी वेटेज एग्जाम के अंदर काफी ज्यादा अच्छी खासी वेटेज है। जैसे कि अगर बात करें तो फाइनेंशियल इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स जिनके अंदर इंडेस 32-109, बिजनेस कॉम्बिनेशन इंडेस 103, कंसोलिडेशन में बहुत सारे स्टैंडर्ड्स हैं जैसे कि इंडेस 110, इंडेस 111, इंडेस 27 और 28, और इसके अलावा रेवेन्यू इंडेस 115 और लीजर्स इंडेस 116। ये सभी टॉपिक्स ले दे के आप लगा सकते हैं ऑन एन एवरेज 65-70% आपकी मार्क्स कवर करता है। तो ये इंश्योर करने के लिए कि आप अपनी चीजों को जल्दी कवर कर पाएं और साथ में इसके अंदर इन डेप्थ कवर कर पाएं और साथ में एग्जामिनेशन के अंदर आप इस पर अच्छी तरह से अच्छा स्कोर कर पाएं। ये बैच शुरू होने जा रहा है ऑन द 17th ऑफ नवंबर और इसके अंदर जो टाइमिंग्स रहेंगे वो रहेंगे 8:30 to 10 इन द मॉर्निंग। 1.5 घंटे का बैच है, मंडे टू फ्राइडे ये बैच रहेगा। और इसके अलावा ऑफ कोर्स मेरा एक रेगुलर बैच भी चलता है, तो आप टॉपिक सभी कवर कर सकते हैं, बट दिस बैच विल बी मेनली कॉन्सेंट्रेटेड टुवर्ड्स जो टॉपिक्स मैंने आपको मेंशन किए। डिस्क्रिप्शन बॉक्स के अंदर आपको इसके अंदर लिंक मिलेगा बैच का, तो आप अपने प्लान्स के हिसाब से अलग अलग पीरियड का इसके अंदर सब्सक्रिप्शन प्लान ले सकते हैं। मेरा कोड इस्तेमाल कर सकते हैं CAKB10, जिससे आपको 10% इमीडिएट डिस्काउंट भी मिलेगा। तो आइए let's crack it.
Well, as we said that there are a total of 4 adjustments, so we can say in terms of 4 adjustments, there is number 1, recognition. Number 2, it's called derecognition. Number 3, it's called reclassify. And number 4 is called remeasure. So you can see the interesting terms. That is the 4 terms. It all starts with practically R except the derecognition. Sometimes I call them as RD. It's like, the research and development where you got the R square and D. So one is what you call the recognition, reclassify, remeasure, and D stands for derecognition. So these are the four adjustments which are required to be done in terms of making the opening, that is the third balance sheet, on the date of transition. Now let's have a little input in terms of each of these adjustments. Now when we say recognition, that means when a company is making the first, you can say, the opening balance sheet, the third balance sheet on the date of transition, we need to ensure that we recognize all the assets and liabilities which are required by virtue of Ind AS. So maybe those assets and liabilities were not previously recognized by virtue of, you can say, the previous gap, but then these assets and liabilities might be required to be recognized. I think the best example what comes to my mind is a little technical one, but you would see that when we apply Ind AS, earlier there never used to be any, you can say, deferred tax implications on the land. But now when you go to apply Ind AS, there is going to be a recognition of a deferred tax asset which will arise on account of a land. That means Ind AS would require you to recognize a DTA on a land. But if you look at the concept in terms of the previous gap, it was not there. So in a very idealistic situation, when you're making the opening Ind AS balance sheet, forget about the E&E exemptions and the exceptions. We need to recognize all those assets and liability which are required to be recognized based on the Ind AS. So that's called the recognition adjustment. That go in for the recognition of all the assets and liability which are required by the Ind AS, irrespective the previous gap was not reflecting the same. The second is in terms of the opposite, you can say, adjustments, and that is a derecognition. In certain cases, the Ind AS may not require you, it may not allow you to recognize certain assets and liabilities which perhaps might have been recognized under the previous gap. That means in my previous gap opening balance sheet, there might be certain assets and liability, which the Ind AS technically prohibits you. So those assets and liability needs to be derecognized from the books of accounts. Now, as we're going to go to the, E&E, the exemptions and exceptions, you will see that there are certain exceptions to the recognition principle. There are certain exceptions to the concept of a derecognition principles as well. So there might be certain cases which will prohibit you in terms of recognizing that asset and liability which was already in the books of accounts as per previous gap, but there seems to be a need to go in for the removal of the same. So this is exactly opposite of the first adjustment. Then comes the third exception. So, but you didn't give an example on a derecognition. Well, we'll talk of certain cases because certain examples giving at this stage could be a little more technical. So don't worry, as we're going to come to those E&E, we certainly also going to pinpoint you, this is a recognition exception or exemption. This is a derecognition exception or exemption. So I hope you're getting the point that we've got the general principles of recognition, derecognition, reclassifications, as well as remeasurements. And then we've got some E&E related to all these four adjustments. The third adjustment is what you call a reclassification. Now, reclassification would not technically, change the total of the balance sheet, for example. Now, the best example what comes to my mind on a reclassification is that under the previous gap, the redeemable preference share capital was reflected as a part of the share capital. So it was reflected as a part of the equity in the previous gap financials. But now considering the Ind AS position, it would require that a redeemable preference share capital is going to be something which we can say is a liability. It's a borrowing. So that means there is a need to reclassify, that means change the presentation of certain items in the financials. So the best example, as I said, is the preference share capital which was a part of the equity earlier in the previous gap and now needs to be reclassified as a financial liability, we can say a borrowing. Then comes finally the fourth adjustment, and that is what we call a remeasurement. In certain places under the previous gap, the measurement principles might have been based on what we call a historical cost approach. But in terms of the Ind AS, the subsequent remeasurements might be taking place at a fair value. So the question arises that if we were measuring that particular asset and liability at a certain, you can say, measurement principle, let's say a cost. And now we know that as per India's, the subsequent measurement should change at a fair value. So in these particular cases, there would be certain remeasurement, you can say adjustments as well. Now, I know what might be coming to your mind is that if there is a reclassification, it would not lead to a difference in the books of accounts. But if there is a, let's say, a remeasurement or a recognition, derecognition, then that would lead to differences in the books of accounts as well. Suddenly you're going to de-recognize an asset or liability which was already in the books, or you're going to recognize something, then where do you take the corresponding changes to? Generally, I'm saying generally the impact is going to be taken in terms of retained earnings. So generally, when all these four adjustments will be done in the books of accounts, that means we're switching over from a previous gap to the index in terms of the opening balance sheet. So any kind of changes arising out of these four adjustments, typically I would say three adjustments, not reclassification, is going to be generally taken place in terms of retained earnings. But yes, there can be certain exceptions as well, which we'll see in terms of business combinations, where the impact could be taken in terms of goodwill itself. But it's not always retained earnings. It could be, a certain relevant component of the equity as well. But generally, we can say the impact would be in the retained earnings. So in this particular video, what I've given you the essence is in terms of when you're going to make the opening index balance sheet. In those particular cases, you need to ensure a retrospective accounting, which is possible through these four adjustments. And these four adjustments will now have certain exemptions and certain exceptions, which are given in terms of Appendix BCD. We're going to talk of that in the next video. Thank you for watching the video, and bye-bye and take care.